I'm Al Bratton. I, I own Woodstrip Watercraft. I started building canoes in 1987. I am in Gilbertsville, Pennsylvania. I first started canoeing at about 8 years old. With my parents, we went camping and canoeing as family vacations. Our first boat was a wood boat. It wasn't a canoe, it was a rowboat. Our, our second was a wood slash canvas, a wood framed canvas canoe. It wasn't a full wood canvas canoe. It was a wood framed canvas canoe that constantly leaked. And I got into building canoes, but it's a pretty long story. I was living in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and the lieutenant commander from the aircraft carrier Lexington moved in next door to me, and he wanted to get out of the Navy and start building wooden day sailors. And while we were looking and forming a partnership, his wife got pregnant with their second and third, and he decided to stay in the Navy. So I downsized to canoes and kayaks. Originally, it was all strip built canoes, and then it became strip built canoes and restorations, and then kayaks and guide boats. But I opened in October of 1987 and went full time in April of 1988. Initially, yeah, I read books and I built my first canoe in my backyard in July of '87 from a book. Didn't like that boat, so I looked around and did some design work on my own. Um, but mostly it was originally from books. In '88, I met Jules Weibel and Judah Drobe at the wooden boat show up at Newport, Rhode Island, and I joined the WCHA. And in '89, I started coming here, and most of the rest of what I've learned is from coming up here. I've interacted with a lot of builders up here, and some of the older builders, Horace and Bill Clements, when I was early on, and of course Roland and Jerry, who were here back in the '80s and early '90s. Um, and even today, I learned from people like Pam and um, Tom Seavey. We had a conversation last night about varnishes. But yeah, I learn from any place I can. I build what are known as cedar strip canoes, wood strip epoxy canoes, and and kayaks, sea kayaks, and I also build a cedar strip Adirondack guide boat from the Rushton Designs. The designs I use are my own now, but they sort of intermixed parts of originally E.M. White designs and Old Town Guide designs because I liked those canoes. Um, but then I started fitting boats to individual people. I find it, especially in solo boats, it's very important to fit a person to the size of the boat and for what they're doing. Because if they have too small of a boat, they're in the water all the time. If they have too big of a boat, they're blowing around the lake. So it's really nice to have a conversation with the potential buyer to narrow down what they're doing, what they do most, um, and fit the boat to them. That especially goes for sea kayaks, which are very personally fitted. I use a lot of Western red cedar for hulls. The trim on most of my boats is mahogany. I will use other hardwoods for trim. My wife's boat's walnut trimmed. Um, I occasionally use some ash. I don't really like to, but some customers like that white color, so I do that. I buy most of my woods from a wholesaler or directly from a sawmill. My hardwoods come from a sawmill. My Western red cedar comes from a wholesaler about an hour from my shop, and I can go in and not only just order the wood I want, I can hand pick it, so I can find the stuff that I like the best, color wise, and all that kind of stuff. I'm a little different than most of the other builders. I use a lot of hand power tools. I use a lot of hand plane or power planers. The table saw is my friend most of the time. Um, but then I go into using a lot of smaller hand tools, spoke shaves and small planes and stuff like that. Um, I do, because of the nature of the construction I use, do a lot of sanding, so I use a lot of random orbit sanders on the fiberglass and whatnot. Unusual projects would be the large war canoes, the 25-foot war canoes. I just finished a 1915 to 1920 Lakefield board and batten canoe that is still being raced. The woman who owns it's 72 years old. Her father bought her an old canoe in the 1940s because she wanted to learn to sail. He set it up for sale, and she's been sailing it ever since. But it turns out it's almost a 100-year-old Peterborough style board and batten canoe, and I just refinished it for her so she could continue to use it on a weekly basis racing. I have been doing restorations since 1990, I guess. Mostly wood canvas, occasionally the all wood canoe. Um, but and it's become about 70% of my business because you got to keep money flowing in the shop and all that kind of stuff. But I've done everything from the 25-foot war canoes to little 12-footers. Um, but the tools and the process for doing wood canvas restoration requires different skills than building a stripper. In a stripper, there's not really any steam bending or anything for bending ribs or even any tacking or nailing because they're edge glued together. In the wood canvas canoes, there's a lot of different skills. Fitting up refitting the planking and replacing ribs and inwales and whatnot all requires a whole lot of different skills. So it took a while to learn that, and that's what I learned mostly up here. Restoration projects, that Lakefield that I just finished was probably the most difficult because there's a lot going into a 100-year-old boat like that, and there's a lot of tacks and there's a lot of sealing to do because it's got to be watertight, of course, and it's got to be solid because she's racing it, and there's a lot of forces on a boat when you throw a sail on it. In terms of building projects, in 2007, I built my second Adirondack guide boat, and on the first one I had some help. I was building it at the Adirondack Boat Building School in Racket Lake, where I taught. The second one I built for one of our WCHA members and delivered it at assembly. So it was difficult in the fact that I was using all cherry trim, and we handmade the seats and we handmade all of the extra parts. On the first one there was some store-bought parts that went into it, but it also, because it was coming up to assembly, it had to look perfect. I didn't want to bring up a boat that didn't look perfect. And that one's still in use. It's up on Cape Cod. I have had 4 apprentices. At one time I had 3 employees working for me at once. Now I do it all myself again. I have taught at the boat building school, and one of the students that I taught there has now opened a part-time shop building cedar strip canoes, so that's kind of cool. But the boat building school, what I taught there is a 9-day course where each pair came up and built their own cedar strip canoe, and by the 8th day we could put it in the water. The fiberglass was all on, it was all sanded, and when they took it home it was ready to be varnished. I've also taught there. I've taught paddle making classes, and I've taught paddle making classes at my shop and at several places down the Jersey Shore and Philadelphia Canoe Club, and a couple other places. My customers are very different. Last year, I built one that the customer was a woman who wanted to buy her husband a wedding present. So we built him a 16-foot guide canoe. It's not one of my normal sizes, but they wanted to take two dogs with them, so it's a little wider than my normal one. But you have young people like that want to still want a boat to use. You have some people who just want to display a boat. Um, my restoration, on the other hand, is mostly people that either have family boats or boats in camps in the Poconos or the Adirondacks or the Catskills, and they're preserving their family history. So they keep that boat at the camp and still use them. The wooden canoe market and the wooden kayak market is rather limited, and the materials are getting more and more expensive. And we have a lot of our customer base for wooden canoes tends to be an older market. It's not the first time canoers, and the young people don't have the kind of finances to buy these kind of boats. So a lot of it's collectors, a lot of it's family boats. But I think there's always going to be a certain niche for it. And having been doing it 25 years, it's not like we're running out of work. Right now I have probably 6 months worth of work in the shop right now. And I know come August and September this year that restoration work will start coming in for the spring, because there'll be a lot of people bringing their boats home from the family cabin that need repaired, and that's when they seek you out to do new ones, to do restorations. New boats is a little more difficult. There's a lot of teaching that has to go on and a lot of trial and error that has to go on. A lot of times I'll go to shows and put people on boats and let them try it and let them paddle it, and then they'll come back and talk to me. And it might be 6 months before they really order a boat. But the younger market is where we need to develop the enthusiasm for wooden boats. And without that, we're going to slowly fade out. I go to boat shows. I go to fairs. I go to outdoor shows and stuff like that. One of my biggest shows every year is down in Tuckerton, New Jersey, and that show is mostly decoy and gunning people, but they're outdoors people, and those people bring up their kids outdoors, so they're used to being out in kayaks, they're used to being out in canoes or sneak boxes, they're used to hunting, they're used to fishing. And I think that market needs to be developed more in order to keep the traditions alive. Down at the Tuckerton show, the emphasis is keeping the traditions of the Barnegat Bay alive. And I think we need to develop a lot of relationships with those kind of places. I have an internet presence. My website is part of the WCHA website. Woodstrip.wcha.org. I have a Facebook presence for Woodstrip Watercraft, and on the Facebook, I try to keep changing pictures and changing the letting people know what's going on in the shop. On the website is the prices and the catalogs and some of the pictures of finished boats. But on the Facebook page, there's a lot of boats in process and that kind of stuff, and that helps. I've had a few people find me on the internet. Recently, mostly restoration works have been coming from that. Most of the new boats are a see them, feel them, try them kind of a thing. It's not. There's not a lot of people that are just going to buy one off the internet. They have to physically see it and try it and know that that's what they want. Fitting a boat to a person is extremely important. As solo canoes, a guy my size is, I'm almost 200 pounds. A guy my size can use a lot of different boats, but not the real tiny ones. But the difficulty becomes for a smaller person, 100-pound person, 125-pound person, or even a child that wants a good boat. If it's not fitted to them, they're not going to like the experience. They're not going to like being on the water. And that's going to color their whole life. When they think about going canoeing, if they think it's a lot of work because they've been in this great big boat and can't handle it, they're not going to be back. If they have a boat that they like and they feel safe in and they can maneuver, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to stay in the field and in the sport. And that's a big part of it. My wife's first kayak that I made for her, she hated kayaking, but all of her experiences were with fiberglass production boats, and they were in the 1990s. They were all meant for guys, bigger guys. And she'd get out there in the bay and she'd blow around in the wind. She wouldn't be able to control it, and she hated it. I made her a little 16-foot, 21-inch wide sea kayak that fit her. And she said, wow, I can actually do this. And it made a difference. Her solo boat, she waited almost 10 years for her first solo canoe. And now she won't part with it because that's, even though it's probably not the perfect boat for her now, she likes that boat and she can handle it and she's comfortable in it. And that's kept her able to paddle. I mean, it's one thing to get into a generic tandem boat, and you can paddle a tandem boat. A lot of tandem boats you can adapt to. But it's another thing when you paddle solo and you paddle by yourself. The boat really needs to fit. I have pictures of those little Rushton canoes from last year's or 2 years ago's assembly. And those little girls in there were like little tiny little girls, and they looked so cute. And I took pictures today from up on the balcony behind the dining hall of them launching this morning. And he's gotten very, very into wooden canoes because of that. He also now has sitting over here a nicely finished red garish canoe that somebody wanted to sell this wooden canoe, and he bought the garish for $400, and he had another builder restore it, and it looks great. But now he's got a collection. He's got several boats because the family enjoys going out, and whether it's in the little tiny boats up here or it's in a pair of wood canvas boats on the river, it's great. It's great, and that's what we need to do. We need to be able to accommodate those kind of people, but that's an expensive process. Those little Sarrigamps and those little wee lassies that he has are not cheap boats. He's probably got a good bit of money into buying boats for his family, but it's important to him. Jean, my wife's role as a secretary to the board evolved from my being on the board. I was on the board for almost 20 years. And early on, the secretary for the board was a board member, and she was having trouble focusing on the issues and writing it down. So Jean came along and volunteered to write the stuff down for Julie. And that evolved into a paid position, and then Jean decided she didn't want to be paid for it because that way she could do it on her time and the way she wanted to. And we did develop a chapter. We started when we came up here in 1989, our first assembly here at Paul Smith's. There was 2 chapters. There was a chapter in Illinois, and there was the New York chapter, which was the first chapter. And I thought, what a great idea. What a way to keep people connected year-round. And then there's also the added advantage, if you are the chapter head, you can have chapter meetings at your shop, and it brings people to the shop. So it's also a wise business decision. But we've been running a chapter since 1990. I think it is July of 1990. We started by having a picnic on a lake, and whoever showed up, we signed them up. And Harold Deal came up with his birch bark canoe and gave some demonstrations. And it was a lot of fun. We've had a lot of we have winter programs on canoeing, aspects of construction or repairs or paddle making or stand making or whatever. And then we eat good. Every winter meeting we have a potluck. So and then we paddle during the summer, starting in April through September or October. We paddle. But it's been a good group, and it's coalesced into a group that has become good friends. One of the examples of that is this past winter. One of our chapter members has an old 1916 Old Town HW, a little 15-footer, and he uses it hard. I mean, he uses it every weekend. He paddles rivers, he paddles lakes. He drags it over beaver dams, so the planking was getting beat up and the canvas needed replaced, and he didn't have the money to do it. He's been out of work for a while. So the chapter decided to rebuild it for him. So they spent all winter. A couple of the guys would come up during the week, and on weekends people would come over and work on this boat. And in June we put it back in the water at Trap Pond at our event down there. We had a camping weekend down at Trap Pond, and to see him, how happy he was when that was done, is really cool. And it's just because that group has developed such a friendship that they thought it important that be done. When I paddle with our group, it's a social thing. But when I go out paddling for myself, I usually go out to enjoy nature. And I find it very relaxing and very pleasing to be out in a wooden boat. It's especially one that I've made, because it's just me. I used to do a summer trip, or no, not really a summer trip. It was an October trip in my sea kayak. This is just as an example. And I would go down to the barrier islands of Northern Virginia, the eastern shore of Virginia above the Chesapeake Bay Tunnel. And I like to go out and sit and look at nature. And there's nothing better than going down there during the dolphin migration and sitting in a pod of dolphins and looking over these little low barrier islands to the bay behind them and looking at a pair of eagles and their two juveniles and just enjoying the moment. That's what I like to do. Whether it's canoeing on the Delaware and just going by myself, I'm floating down the river and watching the eagles or the hawks, or going out in the bay or the ocean and doing the same thing. That's why I paddle. I would tell you that a boat builder does, a wooden canoe builder especially, does what he does because he loves to do it. Not one of us that's here as a wooden canoe builder is getting rich building canoes. We do it. It's a good living because it's a good way of life. It's not a great monetary thing, but it provides a lifestyle that's very satisfying, and especially between designing and building and working with your hands and creating something that's pretty, that's beautiful and functional, and the places that we go and the people we've met. It's a nice lifestyle. It's a good lifestyle. I recommend being among these kind of people, the members here. Well, it's funny because I was just talking to my nephew this week about what I do. I don't have any children, so I was telling him when I'm done here, when I retire, or more likely when I die, because I probably won't retire, my shop closes. Um, and he said to me, well, I've been with you on trips, and he's been going with us since he was 4 years old. Um, I might like to do that. Right now, he's working in some other businesses and working on one of his own businesses. But he says, I might like to learn how to do that and do that kind of. That's um, a nice, to me, that's a compliment, because that says whatever he's seen, he thinks it's important enough, and it's mattered to him enough that he would want to do that.